Murdered, a podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered, a podcast, we're diving into part 2 of the Jacob Wetterling case. Last week, we went over how Jacob was taken by a man wearing a mask with a gun on a bike ride from renting a movie from a local convenience store. We also talked about how Jacob's brother and his best friend were with him when he was taken on this bike ride, and then we got into some of the investigation. We talked about a few leads that went nowhere, and we ended last week talking about a psychic named Vernon Seats, who confessed to his psychiatrist that he murdered 2 people when he was younger, which that then led the police to Vernon's house, where they not only found him dead in his bed, but they also found some pretty disturbing things, such as chunks of human hair, multiple children's missing persons flyers, and even laminated pictures of missing children, including Jacob Wetterling. So, as always, if you haven't already, then I would highly suggest going back and listening to part 1 of this case before you try to start the second part, or else this episode is not going to make a lot of sense to you. So, with all that being said, and without further ado, let's get it. So, the psychic, Vernon Seats, his house was gone through and all of that weird-ass shit was found in 2009. But nothing that was found was ever able to be tied back to Jacob or his abduction, which just puts this investigation on pause yet again. There was, however, a fresh slab of concrete that had been poured in one part of Vernon's house, and it wasn't like a new slab of concrete, but it was newer than the rest of the house. And there was also an overturned pile of dirt found in his yard, but after digging through the dirt and busting through the concrete again, nothing was found. That is until 2010 when police decided to start looking into Dan Rassier again, who, remember, Dan Rassier was the 30-something-year-old man that lived at home with his parents, who was a music teacher, that just so happened to be home alone with no alibi on the night that Jacob was taken by the masked man, presumably taken at the end of Dan Rassier's driveway. So police start looking into Dan again, even though they'd been looking into Dan since 1989, and now we're in 2010. They still haven't found one single thing to even almost point to Dan being involved. And at this time, police brought in like big machinery and farm equipment to search through the property where Dan lived with his parents. And honestly, Dan probably wasn't helping himself, because he voiced his concerns to police about how easily it would be for someone to frame him for whatever had happened to Jacob. And Dan wasn't wrong, because police had been pretty public with the fact that they were looking into Dan, and if someone really wanted to, they could put anything related to Jacob's case on Dan's property somewhere, and then just call in an anonymous tip, and that would probably, honestly, be all that police would need to be able to charge and arrest Dan. Especially with the way that law enforcement was so laser-focused on Dan as a suspect in Jacob's case. But Dan is literally telling police this. He's telling them while they're searching his family's farm, like, hey, do y'all realize how easily someone could plant something on our property to make me look good for this crime? You know, since you've already taken it upon yourself to drag my name through the mud so publicly. And he, again, he's voicing these concerns to police. And like I said, Dan wasn't wrong about this. It would have been pretty easy for somebody to frame him for Jacob's abduction, and what we now know was also a murder. But it also doesn't look good that Dan is so openly telling police that he knows how easy it would be for someone to frame him. I mean, in all honesty, this is probably only making Dan look more guilty to police. But Dan was genuinely concerned that the actual killer could have brought Jacob's body to the Rassier farm for police to find. Because the killer would have seen police say that Dan was a person of interest in Jacob's case, and police had been saying this publicly for a little over 20 years at this point. And in 2010, when police brought in excavators and equipment, during this search of the Rassier farm, truckloads of dirt were taken out of the farm, presumably for testing. And police also removed multiple objects from the Rassier farm to take and check for evidence. And all I'm saying at this point is if police would have put this much effort into investigating all of their suspects instead of solely focusing on Dan Rassier, we may have known who Jacob's murderer was a lot sooner than what we did. But that wasn't the case, sadly, and I get that law enforcement just wanted to solve this case, but this had to have been affecting Dan's life, his reputation, his job, his relationship status. This had to have been affecting Dan in more ways than one. because there was clearly a man in this very specific small town general area in this part of Minnesota abducting and sexually assaulting prepubescent boys around the same time that Jacob was taken. There were multiple men that came forward after Jared came forward to tell his story. And remember, Jared is the young boy that was kidnapped and sexually assaulted and then let go just 9 months before Jacob was kidnapped. So after Jared came forward to police again as an adult to kind of just remind them that this had happened to him also, that did end up getting a lot of other men to come forward to say that this exact same thing had happened to them. And they were all coming forward just hoping that this would somehow help in the search for Jacob. But there was someone who had put all these pieces together, and she believed that it had to have been one man that was responsible for all of these kidnappings and all of these attacks that had been happening around the same time in the same area where Jacob was kidnapped from. And that person would be the journalist and blogger Joy Baker. Joy Baker says that she took a leap of faith when she quit her job to start calling herself a writer. And Jacob's case was kind of the case that Joy just never let go. She solely focused and reported on Jacob's case for a good stretch of time, and she eventually pieced together the fact that all of these attacks that happened in the mid to late 80s were all executed in almost the exact same way, with the exact same wordage, the exact same threats, the exact same verbiage, with almost every guy that had come forward about this kidnapping or assault. She was able to piece together that all of the men recalled that the man that had taken them had been wearing a mask of some kind, that the man also had a gun of some kind. Just all these similarities that all matched about these men's account about what happened to them, they also happened to match what Jacob's brother Trevor and Jacob's best friend Aaron also said happened to them on the night that Jacob was kidnapped. And Joy started digging pretty deep into Jacob's case in 2010. Joy dug through archived newspapers and she read through old police reports from that time period. She interviewed witnesses in hopes that maybe one missing piece of the puzzle would finally click. Now, this was a big part of how the Painesville attacks were all linked to one another, because Joy finally came across Jared, who again was the one that was taken 9 months before Jacob. And when Joy finally interviewed Jared, the two were able to piece together a lot of the attacks that took place in Painesville. And once Jared and Joy would finally meet up with these men, who were obviously boys at the time, but, they were also attacked and assaulted. So once Joy and Jared met and interviewed a lot of the Painesville victims, the men would be sent over to the police station to make a formal statement. So Joy ends up being like a really big reason that we know a lot of the information that we've already talked about as far as how the Painesville victims were actually linked to one another. And then somehow all of those attacks led police to look at a different person of interest in Jacob's case. And it was in 2015 that a man by the name of Daniel Heinrich was named a person of interest in the Jacob Wetterling case. Now, police were able to get a search warrant for Heinrich's house. And once I run through the things that were found during the search, I'll kind of go through the search warrant and what the police were actually looking for. But for now, let's talk about Danny, who he was, why he was named a person of interest, and then what was found. So, Daniel, who was just better known as Danny, was a white man in his early 50s from Annandale, Minnesota. Danny was actually originally the suspect of an investigation into a child pornography case, and it was during this search warrant involving Danny and the child pornography investigation that DNA evidence was collected. The DNA evidence that was found and collected at Danny's house was later able to be matched to Jared's case all the way back in January of 1989. And again, Jared was the one that was taken 9 months before Jacob. And police also recovered news articles about Jacob's abduction inside of Danny's house during their search. Now, something to take note of is the fact that Danny Heinrich had actually been a suspect in Jared's case all those years ago. Now, along with the newspaper articles and the DNA that was found in Danny's house throughout the search, police also discovered videos that Danny had taken of young boys. The boys that were on these tapes had no idea that they were being filmed. And they wouldn't have known that Danny was filming them because the boys in these videos were just random boys that Danny would see out in public. So it wasn't like he knew them and they were spending time at his house with him or something. No, these were just innocent boys that happened to be out in public at the same times and at the same places that Danny Heinrich was at. And Danny took full advantage of them being unassuming, underage, complete strangers. Now, let's take a look at this search warrant. The way that police are able to obtain a search warrant is by specifically listing the things that they're looking for. So, for instance, they can't just say, like, hey, that guy Jerry down the street, he kind of looks like a creep. Let's get a search warrant and see if we can go find anything illegal that he may do that we can charge him for. Like, that's not how it works. The police have to be pretty specific about what they're looking for and why they think it's there. So, in the search of Danny Heinrich's house, some of the things that were listed on the warrant were a red t-shirt with the last name Wetterling on the back of it. It also listed that they were looking for human remains and a red hockey jacket with the name Jacob on the front of it. And those are just a few of the things that were listed on the search warrant that police were looking for. And they were specifically looking for these things. So, obviously, with Danny's DNA matching Jared's case, and then the things listed on the search warrant, Danny's looking like a pretty good suspect for Jacob's case. And then something that I waited to mention until now is that Danny had actually been arrested in 1990 for the abduction and sexual assault on Jared. And for whatever reason, the charges were never turned into convictions, and Danny ended up walking. And I don't know if maybe Jared didn't want to testify against Danny or what happened, because it was basically just dropped. But Danny was also a kid at the time, and I could easily see why he wouldn't want to have to face the man that had done these things to him. But then 9 months later, when Jacob was abducted, police actually did question Danny Heinrich. They even took a mold of Danny's shoes to try to match them to the shoe prints that were found at the location where Jacob was taken from. And I'm assuming that the shoe prints weren't able to be matched to the shoe prints that were found at the scene, which could probably be something as simple as Danny got rid of the shoes that he was wearing on the night that he took Jacob, which would then, of course, meant that those weren't the same shoes, which would in turn would mean they wouldn't match. So Danny had actually been talked and questioned to a few times during the investigation into what happened to Jacob. And the police had even had some officers, following Heinrich around for a while just to see if he would, slip up and possibly lead them right to Jacob, because a lot of the times that happens. Police will put a tail on someone, and this person will get nervous and immediately go to the scene of the crime, and then police are able to kind of connect dots from there. But after a while of following Danny Heinrich and nothing of substance being found, police caught off the tail. And it seems like a lot of things were either not looked into closely by police or like they just weren't doing their jobs at all. Because the Sears tire tracks that police had found at the abduction site where Jacob was taken from, the police had also taken a tire track mold of the tires that were on the car that Danny drove. But it seemed like none of these things were really getting police anywhere. And I want to come back later to why this could be just shitty police work. But for now, I want to keep going. So in 2015, after police searched Danny's house, they were able to arrest him on child pornography charges. And then in the summer of 2016, Danny decided to try and get himself a plea deal. Now, Danny says that in exchange for this plea deal, he will agree to confess to the murder of Jacob Wetterling. But not only would he confess to the murder, he would also take police to the location of Jacob's remains. And I'm not sure if the prosecutor went to Danny to try to talk him into this plea deal or if this plea deal was Danny's idea. But however it got worked out, Danny agreed to finally give the Wetterling family some kind of closure. Of course, he only did this for his own selfish gain, but I'm almost certain that the Wetterling family didn't really care why, and that they just wanted to know for sure what had happened to their son and where he was. Because you have to remember, this is 27 years after Jacob had been taken. So for 27 years, the Wetterling family didn't know if Jacob was still alive or if he was dead. They didn't know if he had been killed right after he was taken or if he had been kept somewhere and killed later. They just had absolutely no idea where Jacob was or what had happened to him. And it just makes it so much more sad to hear Jacob's mom, Patty Wetterling, talk about how for the entire 27 years before Heinrich confessed, they would always watch these stories of people who had been kidnapped and held captive for years in a house, like Ariel Castro's case with Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus, or like the case of J.C. Dugard, who was held captive for 18 years and returned home safely once she was released from her captors. Maybe not released, that's bad wording, but you get what I'm saying. So Jacob's parents and family would see these kinds of stories, and then it would kind of give them like a spark of hope that maybe Jacob was still alive and out there somewhere. But when Danny Heinrich got the plea deal and agreed to tell police where Jacob's remains were and what had happened to him, this was just closure for the Wetterling family, and they had been holding out hope for this for so long. They just wanted to know what happened. Now, the deal was that Danny would tell them what happened and where Jacob's remains were in exchange for only being charged of child pornography. Danny wasn't going to be charged with the murder of Jacob or the kidnapping of Jacob. He would only be charged with child pornography and nothing else. And I'm sure that Jacob's parents had some kind of say-so in this plea deal. I'm sure that they had to have agreed to it, and I'm sure that they only agreed to it to finally have that kind of closure. Now, another big downside to this plea deal was that Danny would only be facing 17 to 20 years for the child porn charges. Danny could potentially be out of prison when he's in his 70s. So 17 to 20 years is what Danny was looking at with this plea deal, which is insane to me because that is less time than Jacob had been missing for, which just doesn't seem right at all. But that's what they decided to do. And of course, this plea deal was only on the table if Danny was able to actually lead police to the remains of Jacob Wetterling. So no Jacob, no deal. Danny Heinrich was able to point police to the exact spot where Jacob's remains were found. And after police recovered the body, they were able to positively identify that this was in fact the remains of 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling. Now, when it came time for Danny to confess to the kidnapping and the murder of Jacob, he was asked, quote, "On October 22nd, 1989, did you kidnap, sexually assault, and murder Jacob Wetterling?" And Danny simply answered, quote, "Yes, I did." From here, Danny said that he saw Jacob, Trevor, and Aaron while he was driving down the road. And he saw the boys when they were on their way to the Tom Thumb store to rent a movie. Danny says that when he saw the three boys, that he turned his car around and he parked it. He decided to just kind of hide out in his car until the boys made their way back home and they got closer to him where he was in his car. Once the boys left the store and rented a movie, as they were heading back to the Wetterling house, he waited until the boys got closer to where he was in his parked car. Danny says that once the boys got closer, that he put on his mask and he grabbed his gun, which was a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson Special. So this would have been a pistol or like a handgun. And I always have to remind myself that not everybody are gun people and that some people don't know anything at all about guns. So I at least try to break it down so that you can at least like envision what I'm talking about. So Danny put on his mask, he grabbed his gun, and he confronted the boys. Danny's retelling of that night is the exact same as what Trevor and Aaron said had happened. They all said that Danny told Aaron and Trevor to run and to not look back or he would shoot them. Danny says after that he made Jacob get into his car. Danny then recalled that he put handcuffs on Jacob and he had his hands behind his back. Now, with Jacob having his hands behind his back in handcuffs, Danny put Jacob into the front passenger seat of his car. Danny then says that he drove off with Jacob in the front seat of his car. He says that Jacob asked him at one point what he had done wrong, which I feel like this just goes to show you how young Jacob actually was. He was 11, and he's asking a complete stranger what he'd done wrong because he thought he was in trouble. Danny says that he started hearing police chatter on his scanner, so he decided to drive himself and Jacob back to his hometown of Painesville, which again is where all the attacks on all those boys was happening in the mid to late 80s. And spoiler alert, all of those attacks in the mid to late 80s, they were all done by Danny Heinrich too. So once Danny gets back to Painesville with Jacob, he drove them into an empty field and made Jacob get out of the car and undress. He sexually assaulted Jacob for a half an hour or so before Danny saw a police car ride by on the main road right from where he and Jacob were in this field. And he says that seeing this police car sent him into a panic. So this is the point that Danny tells Jacob to turn around so that Danny can use the restroom. Danny says that once Jacob turned around, that this is when he loaded his gun. He says that the gun had not been loaded up to this point. He says that he put 2 bullets into the gun while Jacob was turned around, so Jacob would have had his back to Heinrich at this point. Danny pulled the trigger once, and he heard nothing, and he saw that Jacob was still standing. The gun had actually backfired. So Danny pulled the trigger again, and this time Jacob fell on the ground and presumably died instantly from the gunshot wound. Danny left Jacob in that field for a few hours while he walked home. This is just so sickening to me. Like, in the transcripts of Danny confessing to all of this, so it's not on audio or video, so you can only read it, so you don't really get the, emotion behind it, if that makes sense. You only read it the way you want to read it. So, the way I read it, Danny just seems to be answering these questions just so matter-of-factly without a care in the world. Danny says that he returned to where Jacob's body was a few hours later, and he returned with a shovel. Danny literally tells this attorney that he's doing this confession with that the shovel that he'd brought with him was too small, and then he realized that once he got there, that it would have taken him hours to dig a grave with such a small shovel. So Danny says that he knew that there was a construction company right next to where he'd shot Jacob at, and since it was already after midnight, nobody would be there. So Danny walked over to the construction company and borrowed a bobcat that he found the key to. And the best way that I can describe a bobcat would be to think of those huge yellow pieces of machinery with the big bucket scooper on the front. Yeah, one of those. So Danny drove the bobcat back to where Jacob's body was, and he buried him about 100 yards away from where he actually shot him at. Danny says he then tried to use tree limbs and brush to cover up the freshly dug dirt. So Danny returns the bobcat to the construction company, and then he walked back home. Now, Jacob would stay in this burial spot for about a year. And after about a year, Danny says that he walked back to the burial site and shined a flashlight over the place where he'd buried Jacob, because he'd buried Jacob within walking distance of his house. Danny says that when he shined the light in that direction, that he could see a lot of Jacob's remains and his red jacket were unearthed. He says that he had brought a trash bag with him, and that he also had a military-style tool or something. He had that with him, and he would use that to bury Jacob in a different spot. This spot was right across the street from where he was originally buried. Danny says that he bagged up the bones that he could see and all of Jacob's clothes, and he carried them in the bag across the street where he buried Jacob again. And this second burial location would be the exact spot where Jacob's remains were found 27 years later. Now, after Heinrich gave his confession about Jacob's murder, it was easy for police to link Danny Heinrich to the Painesville assaults and to the kidnapping and sexual assault of Jared, who again was the one taken and assaulted 9 months before Jacob. But yet again, Danny would not be charged with any of these kidnappings or assaults, because the statute of limitations was up on any charges that they may try to pin him on with these Painesville attacks and Jared's attack. But all of the boys that were, of course, now men that Heinrich had assaulted and abducted, they all said that bringing Jacob's remains home gave them some kind of closure that they all feel like they needed. And honestly, I feel like now that they all knew who had done this to them, and they had kind of linked that to Jacob's case, with whatever amount of small justice Jacob was able to get, I think that they kind of just made this to where it had to be enough for them. But you'll never convince me that Jacob was Danny Heinrich's only victim, because we know that he abducted and assaulted a shit ton of boys before this. So I just don't see a world where this is the one and only time that he murdered one of his victims. And another thing that I'd be willing to bet money on is that not every man that was abducted and assaulted came forward. I'm sure some of them just never told a soul about what happened to them. And then there could be a different number of reasons why they didn't come forward and say anything. But I'm sure that there are still more victims of his out there somewhere. So now let's talk about how the police failed this entire family, and how Danny Heinrich could have been arrested long before he actually was. Danny Heinrich was given a polygraph test way back in the early stages of Jacob's investigation, and he failed it pitifully. But he failed it, and he said that he thought it was because he was nervous. Not only that, but Danny Heinrich also had one of only 2 vehicles in that entire area that had those Sears tires on them. So Danny's vehicle had the tires that matched from the tire tracks that were taken from the scene. And then there was only one other car in that entire area that had those same tires. And that other car was just like a junk car that didn't even run, that had just been sitting. And there's actually an entire press conference released by the Stearns County Sheriff's Office after Henrich's confession and after he was finally locked away in a prison cell somewhere. And during this press conference, there was quite literally a new sheriff in town, and he was not playing. This press conference is about an hour and a half long, and I actually made sure to leave it. It is the very first link under the source credits in this episode. And if you have time, I would highly suggest watching it or listening to it, because this new sheriff lays out every single way that the police messed this case up. He doesn't sugarcoat it. He doesn't try to put the blame somewhere else. He tells you how every single mistake that was made by the police led to Danny Heinrich getting away with murder and multiple kidnappings and sexual assaults for almost 30 years. Jacob's family was finally able to do another funeral for Jacob after his remains were found, where his family remembered him and all the quirky things that he used to do, like putting peanut butter in his cereal. And one of the good things that did come out of the Jacob Wetterling case was the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center that was founded by Jacob's parents in 1990. And this was a way for Jacob's parents to educate and inform the public on ways to avoid child abductions, tips and things to do, things not to do, just trying to generally inform everybody about small things that they could do. And then it was in 1994 that Jacob's parents helped to establish the first sex offender list, like the first sex offender registry list. So before this, there was no way to check and see how many sex offenders live within a 5-mile radius of you, which is something that I would highly suggest that everybody do at least once or twice a year. Just check your neighbors in your immediate area to see if anything's changed. Just make yourself aware of your neighbors. Maybe they seem friendly, but they may also be listed as sex offenders. So Jacob's parents did everything in their power to help make sure that this type of thing didn't happen to anyone else's family. And in these kind of cases, that's really all you can do, is try to get some kind of good out of this to make other people aware of how easily this could have been your child, your brother, your friend. And I think that's all I have for you this week. I didn't think this episode was going to be this short, but here we are. But it actually kind of worked out perfect because I just got a call from the school and some kid kicked my kid in the face. So, it's fine. I'm actually thinking about starting the JonBenet Ramsey case next week, but I don't know for sure if 3 weeks will give me enough episodes to finish it before Christmas. Like, I would like to start it and have the last episode be the one that releases on the week of Christmas. I'm just not sure if that's enough episodes. There's a lot in that case, and that is a case that I have studied since I was like 6, honest to God. And we can all thank my mom for that, because even as a child, I was just so immersed with this case. Like, how does that even happen? Okay, I'm getting off topic. We're going to wait and talk about this when I cover that case. So, let's get our review of the week out of the way. And as a reminder, you can leave a written review on Apple Podcast and on Audible. And if you don't have an iPhone or an iPad like myself, and you're more of an Android person, just steal somebody's phone and leave a review that way. I mean, make sure to give it back and make sure to ask their permission. So, I guess I'm just really saying to borrow somebody's phone. But let's get into the review of the week so we can all go finish that stack of Christmas gifts that still need to be wrapped. This review comes from Pretty Bonita, and the caption is A+++. Now, this one is short and sweet, and I love it. This one says, she's on to something. Loved every bit of it. So, that's all I got for you this week. If I don't end up with the JonBenet case next week, we will figure out something else. Don't worry. Patreon members, there's a new episode up. Just posted it Friday. There will be another one hopefully this week. I'm going to get your episodes caught up. That's what I'm doing, I promise. If you want to become a Patreon member to hear the bonus episodes every month, there is a link in the description of this episode and every other episode. Click that, sign up. Pretty quick, pretty cheap, pretty easy. And I promise I'm doing better about getting episodes out. So, let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.